On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Scott Sagan, your moderator for the evening. It's my pleasure to be joined tonight by Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer, Abbas Milani, and Abraham Sofaer. The Iranian-American relationship has been in a state of crisis for many years, with both signs of optimism and signs of pessimism getting mixed together constantly in complex ways. Today, we've had news that exemplifies that mixed relationship. On the one hand, we have announcements from the State Department that the sanctions will be continuing and indeed strengthened in some ways, with a number of countries agreeing to cut back or entirely eliminate the purchases of Iranian oil. We also have President Obama today on Israeli television announcing, quotes, "We think that it would take over a year or so for Iran to actually develop a nuclear weapon, but obviously we don't want to cut it too close." The president then said, "My message to the Israeli government will be the same as before. If we can resolve it diplomatically, that's a more lasting solution. But if not, I will keep all options on the table." Asked if an attack on Iran's nuclear sites was a realistic option, he said, and I quote, "When I say that all options are on the table, all options are on the table. And the United States obviously has significant capabilities." These statements, the mixture of pressure and a statement suggesting that we still have time for negotiations, come soon after the latest rounds of negotiations between the P5+1 and the Iranian government held recently in Kazakhstan. At those meetings, the P5+1 negotiators reportedly announced that they would demand a suspension, but not an entirely shutting down of the Fordo enrichment facility in Iran, and that they would call for moving most, but not entirely all, of the uranium that has been enriched to 20%, and therefore is relatively close compared to other much lower enriched uranium, that they require most of it, but not significantly, not all of it, to be moved out of Iran in exchange for some limited but unspecified reduction in the sanctions regime. The Iranians have not yet accepted this, and our first question for the evening goes to Abbas Milani. Could you tell us how the negotiations in Kazakhstan were represented in Iran, and what you think the room is in Iranian domestic politics for potential compromises on the Iranian position that could lead to a more peaceful solution?
I think it's fair to say that it is the first time, at least the first time I have seen, where the Iranians have given a far more positive iteration of what happened at the meeting than the Europeans, the 5+1. The Iranians considered it a very positive meeting. The 5+1 called it a useful meeting. Iran even declared the sanctions will soon be lifted. Mr. Salehi, the foreign minister, the spokesperson for the 5+1, said there's no such a thing on the table. And as you indicated, the sanctions are being further tightened. So there is a profound difference between what the two sides say has happened. There are, I think, domestic reasons for why Iranians are offering their more positive view. One is that when Almaty was taking place, the Iranian currency was in a free fall. It had lost something like 70% of its value. The Iranian regime was very worried about further losses of value, and they needed to stop the bleeding. And announcing that there was light at the end of the tunnel helped stabilize the market. The market for the currency, the price of the Iranian currency has stabilized. The economic situation in the country is very precarious, and I think it is the direct result of two factors. One, the sanctions. Two, the utter incompetence and corruption of the regime. Both of these have played a very, very critical role in making the Iranian economy the basket case that it has become, in spite of the fact that in the last 7 years alone, Iran has received more than 60% of the entire oil revenue from the day oil was discovered in Iran. That is a remarkable fact, to be able to have that much money and have essentially an economy that has double-digit inflation. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different response. Double-digit unemployment. Unemployment for the youth is estimated by the government to be 30% above the national rate. The national rate conservatively is 12 to 14%. So 40% of the youth, which is 3/5 of the population, are unemployed. Inflation is, again, by some government officials, 25%. Other government officials put it at 50% per month, I'm talking about. So the economy cannot continue. This, to me, indicates a new willingness by the Iranian regime to negotiate.
So how does the upcoming elections in Iran influence the ability of any government to make a compromised position?
I think the upcoming elections are going to be very interesting because Mr. Ahmadinejad has decided to take on the leader, Khamenei, in ways that are virtually unprecedented in the last 34 years. He is directly confronting Khamenei on virtually every issue. He has a candidate of his own that he wants to run. He wants to do a Putin-Medvedev in Iran. His son's father-in-law is his choice replacement. The clergy are adamant not to allow him to even reach the candidacy level. So we're going to have a very contentious election, I think.
And what does the Abbas Milani Gallup poll tell you about what you think might happen?
What I think might happen is that Khamenei, the leader, is going to have to make some kind of a compromise with the reformists. I think the reformists are very much pining to get back in. To me, the only question is which of the reformists will Khamenei allow to run, whether it would be a token reformist or a serious reformist. Khatami has indicated that he's willing to run. And if Khatami runs, every indication is that he can easily win. And that will be a new challenge for Ahmed Khamenei. But it will be also a signal to the West that a more compromising, accommodationist approach is on the horizon. And if Khamenei and the IRGC, which to me are increasingly more assertive in determining domestic and international policy, if they want to show that they are serious about making a deal, then having an election that is more legitimate with a plurality of candidates rather than those handpicked by the leader will work in that direction.
Now that's the more optimistic side of the crisis situation. The president also said that all options are on the table, and we know that the Israeli government has repeatedly been having discussions internal and then occasionally with the United States counterparts about potential military options. Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer has written last year in International Security what I consider the best single study of the effects of the Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear program in the early 80s. Målfrid, could you comment on your views about attack options regarding military options against Iran in light of the analogy about what happened in Iraq?
Sure. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that this military option has actually been on the table many times in history. Already during the 60s, countries were considering attacking China's nuclear program. And time again, countries decided not to do so. They thought it would be counterproductive. So the only two cases that we actually see that are clear instances where a country has attacked another state's nuclear program were Iraq in 1981 and Syria in 2007. And Israel was attacking both of these countries. So let me say a few words about the Iraqi case, which is the one that I know in some detail. surprisingly, the Israeli attack actually triggered a nuclear weapons program in Iraq. So during the 1970s, Iraq was developing a nuclear weapons option. They were examining different technologies and trying to get the basis for a later nuclear weapons program. But they hadn't actually started any serious or organized effort to develop nuclear weapons at that stage. Now, other countries were very much concerned about the Iraqi program, including Israel. And in June 1981, Israel attacked this reactor complex called Osirak that was just on the verge of becoming operational. And that triggered an intensive and determined effort to develop nuclear weapons in Iraq. And that effort went undetected for nearly a decade. So the outside world didn't find any indications of what Iraq was actually doing at that time, which was to mobilize this large clandestine enrichment-based nuclear weapons program. The attack on Iraq back in 1981 was controversial. There were many Israeli officials, including Shimon Peres, who were very skeptical about doing this kind of attack. They felt that it was far too early to try and attack the Iraqi program. They didn't really believe that Iraq was seriously pursuing nuclear weapons at that time. And they thought perhaps it could trigger a much more determined program, which in fact it did. And it's interesting to see that today there is very strong and vocal opposition inside the Israeli government and the intelligence services against striking Iran. And in fact, some of those individuals point to the Iraqi attack and say, this shows us that such attacks can actually be counterproductive. There are some parallels between Iraq in '81 and Iran today, but I think it's important to be cautious about drawing direct comparisons. First of all, the Iranian program today is much more robust, it is much more extensive and much less vulnerable than the Iraqi sort of developing nuclear infrastructure that was attacked in 1981. The Iranians and other countries, including Libya and Pakistan, have been concerned that they would be attacked in a similar way. And they have tried to set up an infrastructure that is much more dispersed and not so vulnerable to a single attack or to a series of attacks. So I think those differences are quite important. Another significant difference is that Iraq was, governed by Saddam Hussein almost personally. Iran is a multipolar political system, and I think we should be cautious about assuming that Iran will respond just like Iraq did, in part for that, for that reason. And finally, there are these proliferation risks look very different. Iraq in 1981 was developing a long-term nuclear weapons option. Iran today is approaching a breakout option, which means that they are much, much closer to being able to actually produce at least one nuclear weapon in a much shorter time frame. So that's another significant difference. But I think that there's one general lesson that we can draw from the Iraqi case in '81, and that's actually something Shimon Peres wrote to the Israeli Prime Minister on the eve of the attack, where he said that what is intended to prevent can actually become a catalyst. So I think the difficulties of understanding the long-term consequences of a military strike in political terms are, particularly worrisome.
Thank you. Abe Sofer, in your new book, Taking on Iran, you argue both against the sense that many Americans have that the only options are a potential attack or a deep sanctions regime, and instead pose a series of alternative approaches to dealing with the Iranian government, specifically focusing on the Revolutionary Guard Corps and potential tough measures that could be taken in the future against them. Would you like to share with us your views on Iran, both in terms of what programs you were involved in the past, but especially what lessons you've learned for dealing with Iran in the future?
be happy to.
Thank you,
Scott.
Ed.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'd like to carry on this point about the attack on the nuclear facilities, that there really is a lot of doubt about the wisdom of that attack, of an attack on the nuclear facilities, or the utility, ultimately, of such an attack. And there's a lot of doubt also about the possibility of containment. So it's a very difficult situation that where these two alternatives that our country has been looking at intently are both very undesirable. People are very worried about the spread of nuclear weapons in the Middle East if Iran goes nuclear. But the fact is that it is very complicated, and we have tried, our administrations repeatedly have tried in dealing with Iran and the nuclear problem to make it seem simple. And all we have to do is just convince Iran that we are very serious about preventing them from having a nuclear weapon. So there's been a sort of war of words, an escalation in rhetoric by the United States in the midst of it's doing virtually nothing to show Iran that it is credibly telling Iran that it means business. And the latest of these, I can't help quoting, is from the Vice President at the APAC conference last week, where he says the U.S. is committed to prevent, and the word prevent comes from last year's APAC conference, where the President, instead of using the word, any other words, the conventional formulation, all options are on the table, he went further and said, we're going to prevent. And the word prevent in international law means you're going beyond dealing with an imminent threat. You're not going to wait for the threat to become imminent. You're going to prevent that threat from being there. So Vice President Biden took it a new step further. We are going to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, period, end of discussion, period. Prevent, not contain, prevent. And then he goes on to say how, and he adds a new phrase, how are we going to do this? We're going to do this because I'm guaranteeing you that, as I tell the President all the time, and the President tells me, big nations can't bluff. So now we're talking about, not only are we saying we're going to prevent it, but we're not bluffing. Big nations can't bluff, and presidents of the United States cannot and do not bluff. He actually said that. That's quite extraordinary, given the history of our dealings with North Korea. And President Barack Obama is not bluffing. He is not bluffing. So what he's done is shown how anxious he is, really, that we are being read as bluffing. That's really what this amounts to. And there's good reason why we're being read as bluffing, because this is a very serious, difficult project if you think you're really going to take out Iran's nuclear program with the use of force.
What other options are there, Abe?
So the option that I've spelled out in my book is to treat Iran seriously, like you would treat a sovereign nation that is not behaving properly. First of all, do not tolerate attacks by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which killed a lot of our people in Iraq by supplying IEDs to the militias, which really supports Hezbollah and has been killing Americans since 1983 with the Marine barracks bombing, was responsible for the bombing of our airmen in the Khobar Towers bombing. We should be pushing back against the IRGC the way we pushed back against the Soviets during the Reagan administration, in which I was privileged to be a part. At the same time, we have to take Iran seriously as a sovereign state and negotiate with them seriously. The P5+1 negotiation with Iran is a joke. We announced that we're not going to do anything for the Iranians that's serious before the meetings happen, and after the meetings occur, we assure everybody that we haven't done anything serious. And the Iranians do the same thing. They were talking to our domestic constituencies and assuring them that we're not going to do anything. With the Soviets, we negotiated all over the place in many different fora, secretly. We tried to make agreements on a number of issues. We didn't make everything hinge on nuclear weapons. We talked about human rights. We made progress on lots of things. And in my book, I spell out the 5 factors that constitute significant negotiations, and they include rhetorical restraint and not tying our willingness to talk to their good behavior, because if you want to talk to a regime that is behaving badly, you can't do it if you make a condition of your talking to them they're changing their behavior, which is the purpose of talking to them to begin with. So it really has made no sense, our approach to Iran. We need to get tougher with the IRGC and smarter with Iran.
Well, before we talk about particular tough measures, let's talk a bit about what are the potential risks if Iran is permitted to acquire nuclear weapons. Because I know there's a common tendency among humans to resort to wishful thinking mechanisms when they think that something, you can't do much about a problem. To think, well, maybe the problem won't be so bad anyway. And to my way of thinking, the greatest danger if Iran is permitted or does acquire, either in the long term after an attack or sneaking out and not being attacked when doing so, acquires a small nuclear arsenal, is not that they are going to immediately do something crazy like attack Israel with nuclear weapons, but rather that they will see nuclear weapons as a shield behind which they can take more aggressive conventional or subconventional terrorist supporting types of activities. And the analogy, I think, here is to Saddam's program, because we now have tapes and documents from the Saddam regime taken after the 2003 war, where he tells his generals that if Iraq is permitted or does successfully acquire nuclear weapons, that of course he would use them as a defensive mechanism so that Israel could not attack Iraq with nuclear weapons while he attacks Israel with conventional weapons, and says that we may lose 50,000 martyrs in a very chilling statement to his own officer corps, but we will get back the occupied territory and then stop there. The nuclear weapons are not just a potential weapon to use in a first strike, they can also be seen as a shield that can protect one while one takes aggressive actions. Are those the fears that you have, or do you fear if the worst comes to worst and Iran does get nuclear weapons, other concerns about proliferation or other potential uses? Målfrid.
If I could just jump in on that first point. First of all, I think that there's a lot more to learn about what Saddam thought about nuclear weapons, and those particular statements were made before he actually had a proper nuclear weapons program. So I don't know if that's something he would agree with necessarily, 10 years later as he was approaching the nuclear weapons threshold. But the point you made about, what will Iran do if it acquires a nuclear weapons arsenal? There are many different scenarios here, and I think those scenarios point in different directions. I mean, one option could be that Iran continues to approach the nuclear weapons threshold, but does not carry out a nuclear weapons test or in any sort of clear and, absolutely, demonstrable way shows that it has this capability.
So it has a latent capability, but not an active capability.
Exactly. That would probably induce restraint, I would think. if something happens, like an attack or any other event that gives Iran, let's say, the excuse to cross the nuclear weapons threshold and develop an arsenal, then it may be more, prone to the kind of activities that you were describing. So I think we need to think through those scenarios, and one important dimension is, does Iran stay within the NPT, and if so, for how long? And that's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because as long as Iran remains inside the treaty, it will be very difficult to go much closer to the nuclear weapons threshold, I would argue.
And it would have to give, under the treaty rules, 90-day notice to the world that it was going to withdraw in the future.
Precisely. And again, if Iran is attacked, it is more likely that it will leave the NPT saying, why should we stay in this treaty when we are attacked by non-members if the attacker is Israel?
Abbas, what's your greatest fear?
Well, first of all, I think it's every indication I have seen is that what they want is exactly a latent nuclear capacity. And they're very much on record saying that they think that if they have latent nuclear capacity, in other words, the exhibited capacity to build at short notice a bomb and deliver it more or less accurately, they have the deterrence they need. And the deterrence they want is a deterrence from outside pressure, from the United States, from Israel. You have to look at it from their perspective. They look at the world, they see Saddam Hussein, and they see North Korea. If you were a leader of any country, which of these two alternatives would you prefer to have? They think having a deterrence, not having the bomb, because making that next step is too costly for them. If you look at the way they have approached this, they have approached this very systematically. I'm sorry that you can't all read Mr. Rouhani, who was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator for some time, his memoir. He describes how they go about it. They're much more systematic, they're much more calculating, and they make concessions when they no longer need that kind of activity. He says very clearly, we wanted to buy time, we wanted to create reality on the ground, and our goal was to achieve this latent capacity. My fear is that if they are attacked, I am willing to bet my last dollar that they will withdraw from NPT and they will declare openly that they will try to make a bomb. And I think it will be very difficult for the international community to argue against it if it is if it's an attack with no cause. If once again a Muslim country is attacked without any action on their behalf, you have to think about this regionally. Iran right now is isolated regionally. Turkey is on the rise. Tunisia is on the rise. A more democratic iteration of Islam is on the rise. The radical Islamism of Iran is dying. But if Iran is attacked, I think you can look at a new lay of the land in the Middle East. Radicalism will be increased. So it isn't just what happens in Iran, but also what happens regionally and what happens in Syria. So if Iran makes that next step, and I don't know whether they will unless they're attacked, then I can again say with some certainty that Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Turkey, Egypt will in very short order try to have some kind of a deterrence to counter Iran's nuclear capability. They're not going to allow, these are Sunni states, they're Arab states, there are historic tensions between them. Those tensions are on the rise, and for an Iranian Shiite state, with the help of Hezbollah in Lebanon, to be a nuclear state is not something that I think the rest of the Sunni Arab world will tolerate.
Now, you're talking about reactions either to a Iranian nuclear program or a large-scale Israeli and or American military attack to stop that program. Abe, in your book, you note not only, as you did here, that the Iranian IRGC supported, through passing on munitions, attacks on American forces in Iraq when we were there, but also that they've engaged in terrorist attacks that have both killed Americans, like at the Khobar Tower in Saudi Arabia, and have supported alleged attack plans against the Saudi embassy in the United States.
Saudi ambassador, yeah.
Right. So can you say what military options or what kinds of threats, when you talk about getting tough, you might take if those events occurred again, and whether you think the reactions would be different than the reactions that Abbas has laid out in response to a large-scale attack?
I think the reactions would be very different, and in fact, I think it's very dangerous to accept the notion that a country gets immunity to behave badly and attack you and kill your people because you're scared they're going to get a nuclear weapon if you defend yourself, exercise your right of self-defense. I think the message that you're going to convey with that kind of a policy is that they are free to get a weapon because you will not do anything about it after they have a weapon. Even after the Soviets had a weapon, which I think I very strongly support the fact that we did not attack the Soviet Union. Eisenhower was completely right in that regard. But even after they acquired nuclear weapons, we made it very clear that anything they did that was viewed by us as aggression, we would respond to. And that is a crucial aspect of any security system for the United States. So I do think there's a big difference, both legally, morally, legitimately, between attacking Iran preventively in order to destroy their nuclear program, which is a very, very difficult thing, and stopping the IRGC from some of these assassination-type activities, providing weapons, which they're doing now in Afghanistan. They're doing now in Afghanistan what they did in Iraq. They supplied these IEDs that killed our soldiers. American soldiers were being regularly killed in Iraq by Iran, by the IRGC. And what did we do? We did nothing to prevent those weapons from coming into the country. I would have taken out the convoys that brought those weapons into the country. I would have gone after the IRGC leadership, which actually came into Iraq, had the audacity to act like they were controlling the militias in Iraq that were killing Americans. I would definitely attack them. And when they came after the Saudi ambassador and wanted to assassinate him in Washington, D.C., they were ready to kill lots of Americans in a restaurant with that bombing. I certainly would not have just indicted the IRGC leadership, which is what we did with Osama bin Laden. We indicted Osama bin Laden twice before we finally realized you don't convince a terrorist leader not to attack America by indicting him when he's in a country.
What would you have done other than indict the IRGC leadership?
I certainly would have gone after the IRGC leadership. I would go after them today. I think they are walking around thinking they're immune, and they've created a sense within Iran that they read us correctly, not the liberals, not the smart guys, the intellectuals, but they, the thugs of Iran, read us correctly. And as long as that's true, their influence will continue to grow. IRGC members who were responsible for the blowing up of the Israeli embassy and the Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, killing hundreds of people, destroying a Jewish community, incidentally, the leader of that conspiracy was made the Minister of Defense of Iran. So this is the increased influence that they're getting as a result of our allowing them to be immune. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't just use force for using force. I would use force to make it clear to them that we want to engage them the way we engaged the Soviet Union, negotiate with them the way we negotiated professionally with the Soviet Union, in depth, everywhere, on all issues. We have not done that with the P5+1 negotiation.
We have a wonderful set of questions from the audience, and I'm going to be reading some of them, sometimes collecting them together, and we'll be directing at least the initial comment to one of my Stanford colleagues here. The first question has to do with Iranian domestic politics. So Abbas, I wonder if you could help us understand, how do the Iranian people the man on the street, the woman on the street, if you will, feel about the spending of the money on the nuclear power program and not on more pressing domestic needs?
Well, doing serious polling in Iran is not legal unless you are the IRGC and they are kept secret. On rare occasions, we have had a glimpse into what the people might think. The radio and television, which is a state institution in Iran, decided to have a poll on its website. And it asked people a number of questions, including, do you think we should continue on this path in terms of the nuclear program? Do you think we should make concessions? Do you think it is our responsibility to convince the world that we have peaceful intentions? Within 24 hours, more than 64% of people who went online basically said they are not in favor of continuing this confrontational path. Within 30 hours, the government took down that poll, and within 48 hours, they had a theory of what had happened. They said it was the BBC and the Zionist agents who went online and polluted this poll. This wasn't really the poll of the Iranian people. This was a trick of BBC who hacked into our program and did it this way. My sense is that when there was 3 million people in the streets of Tehran demonstrating what they thought was a rigged election in 2009, one of the slogans that became very controversial was neither Gaza nor Lebanon, but Iran. The idea being quit spending money on Hezbollah, quit spending money on Hamas, spend it here. I would think that that would be the sentiment that most people have. But if you go, as many of these pollsters, they call from, some of the polls that you get here as polls would flunk our classes at Stanford. If a student tells me that I'm going to sit at Stanford and call 100 people in Iran and say, I'm a student at Stanford, I'm calling from Palo Alto, do you favor the nuclear program in Iran? If you think there is one person in Iran who doesn't believe that phone is being bugged and monitored, then I have a bridge right outside here that I would like to sell you. See me after the talk.
Great. We have a question from the audience about the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and their position on the Iranian program. And perhaps, Målfrid, you'd want to answer that. Is the IAEA has refused has stated that it can't confirm that Iran is acting within its legal rights. That is, that it can't confirm that it has ended some of the suspect programs. Can you comment on the IAEA's position? Do you think it's a credible, legitimate position that they're taking? Some people have said that Amano, the Director General, is too pro-Western and not as even-handed as Mohammad al-Baradei, his predecessor. What do you view about the IAEA's position on Iran?
Well, I think the IAEA is often between a rock and a hard place in these situations.
Or between Iran and a hard place, I guess.
Perhaps. Also, if you look back at the Iraq situation a decade ago, I mean, they have a member state and they are investigating whether that member state has done something illegal, and the other members are pressuring them to go in one direction or the other. And at the moment, there's a lot of noise about the IAEA, whether the IAEA inspectors are they all spies, or are they all, neutral observers? There's a lot of noise, and Israel has also, a couple of years ago, criticized the agency for not being credible, because they mainly get information from Iran itself through either declarations or by going to sites that Iran will let them enter and collect information there. And Israel says that, there could be much more going on that the agency doesn't know about. So there's a lot of criticism. I would say, though, that the agency has by far the most access to sites on the ground in Iran, and that their track record suggests that while we should perhaps realize the limitations, they have a pretty good sense of what goes on. And some of the key concerns that they are raising are about long-standing issues that go back a decade. Whether Iran has declared, why it hasn't declared everything it perhaps should have, and where it has bought certain items on the black nuclear market, and so on. And more recently, there are concerns that Iran may be doing weapons-related research in facilities that are not, strictly speaking, nuclear facilities, and therefore not declared to the IAEA. So the agency wants more access on the ground in Iran, and needs that really to have a clearer sense of the full picture.
We have a question about the relationship of Israeli suspected nuclear capabilities in Iran. And maybe you want to tackle it, Abe, first, and others could as well. And one of the members of the audience asks, if Israel were to reduce its number of nuclear weapons, would this reduction be a bargaining chip and help with the Iranian negotiations?
Well, I don't think so. I do think, though, that in a negotiation where a lot of progress were made, this issue would come up toward the end of the negotiation. It would be a very difficult issue. But the Israelis have made it very clear that they will not negotiate about something they don't even admit they have, and that they will negotiate about nuclear arms if they can have peace treaties with everyone in the Middle East. So this is not a problem that should be regarded as impossible to solve at any point. So it's something we should not deter us from trying to make a deal with Iran, and we will face it and deal with our Israeli friends when that comes around to be a real issue.
Speaking of our Israeli friends, Obama is scheduled to be going to Israel soon. Excellent. His relations with Netanyahu have not been entirely close, one might say, during the last election. How do Israeli domestic politics influence the pressures or the capabilities of Netanyahu to use a military option if he feels it is necessary?
Well, there's been a huge divide within Israel over the issue of attacking Iran preventively, especially the nuclear program. Most national security experts in Israel, just as most national security experts in America, are opposed to such an attack. With Barak leaving the government, he was looked upon as more hawkish even than Netanyahu, and the Israeli tension being shifted much more to domestic issues over this last election, I think there'll be much less pressure on Obama and on Netanyahu to deal preventively with the Iranian threat at this for the next year or so.
We have a very interesting question from a distinguished member of the audience asking, since the Imam has issued a fatwa saying that the Quran forbids the development of nuclear weapons, why can't the U.S. and the West accept that at face value? That is, perhaps Iran has drawn its own red line in the sand. Abbas?
The reason that cannot be taken at face value is that I can cite you at least 100 other fatwas by 100 other ayatollahs that were as clear and categorical as what seems to be Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa, which were later changed because circumstances changed. The Grand Ayatollah in Iran issued an absolute fatwa against the use of radio. Ayatollah Khomeini in 1963 issued a fatwa against women's right to vote. He said that's the first step towards harlotry. 15 years later, he changed his fatwa. He says women should have the right to vote. So circumstances change, fatwas change. Fatwa is just one ruling of one cleric at any one time. Moreover, there is in Shiism the concept that is troubling to some in the West, and it is the concept of taqiyya. Taqiyya is a concept peculiar to Shiism. It is not in the Sunni faith. It means dissimulation. It means a useful lie. It means the ability to lie to the infidels in order to save the faithful. When Ayatollah Khomeini in Paris said that Iran will be a liberal democratic state and then created the theocracy that he created, someone dared ask him, how come you went against your words? He said, I was engaging in taqiyya in Paris. So fatwas can change when circumstances can change. If Iran wants to seriously convince the international community that it does not intend to take the next step, I think there are steps that can be taken without insulting Iran's sovereignty, without being undue infringements on Iran's rights. And many of them have been already suggested. Iran could, for example, join the protocol, the extra protocol. Iran could accept to allow much more intrusive inspection of its sites. Iran hasn't allowed the inspection of the site that I think she was referring to, Parchin. There are all kinds of evidence that things have been happening there. If you have nothing to hide, open these things to...
Målfrid.
Well, yeah, and indeed, I think in the recent past couple of years, Iranian leaders have indicated that they would be willing to sign the additional protocol and allow more access than any other member country of the NPT, provided that there would be some kind of agreement between them and the other countries in the international community. So I think that could be achieved, but we'll have to keep an eye on the negotiations.
It seems to me that your question, if you have nothing to hide, why not open up, is it's a rhetorical question, obviously. And it suggests that Iran does have something to hide, and they don't want to acknowledge that. So even if they had something in the past that they've shut down or mothballed, given that in the past they've always claimed they had no nuclear weapons program, it would be more than embarrassing. It would be politically really damaging for them to acknowledge that they've been lying all these years. Isn't that right? Why that would be a politically damaging thing for them to do? Abbas?
Well, it would be politically damaging for them to do it, but if they had played the game the way I think they should have played it, that is, to be open from the beginning. If they hadn't tried to do the kinds of things that they did, they have basically deprived Iran of the right to enrich uranium. Within NPT, Iran has the right to enrich uranium. These guys have played the game so badly that Iran is now considered by the United Nations as not having the right to enrich uranium. If these guys had not stopped the Iranian nuclear program in 1979, Iran's reactor in Bushehr was 70% finished. Khomeini decided that Iran does not need a nuclear program. This was garbage, literally, I'm quoting, sold to Iran by the American imperialists, and he mothballed it. 5 years later, they restarted the program. This time, they decided to do it clandestinely. They decided to go to North Korea, they go to China, they go to Russia, and decided to push the limit at every step. They started Fardu without telling the international community. When the international community says, why didn't you declare it? So, well, the law says we have to declare it when we put in the gas. Technically, they might have been right. But politically, it's suicidal. When the international community does not trust you, why do you push it to the limit and not...
There might be a ready answer to that, and that is they want to develop a nuclear weapon. And if you let them, they'll do it. I mean, that kind of behavior is the behavior of a radical regime. And, on the other hand, Scott, I would have to say that we would never have told the Soviet Union when we were negotiating with them, all you have to do to demonstrate your good faith is X or Y. I mean, that's silly. That's really, it's childish play to think that you treat a real sovereign country. The problem is we don't treat Iran as a real sovereign country. And this is a big difficulty if you want to get international agreements with Iran, because a sovereign country makes international agreements. So you you don't deal with a country like Iran, a radical regime, on the premise that they are going to be persuaded with words to do something that is beneficial to you and damaging to their prestige. It takes pressure and it takes engagement, consistent, across the board, in-depth engagement. And when they do it, when they do something that's positive, don't thump your chest and praise yourself for it. Consider the fact that they are doing something that's difficult for them domestically to do. Treat them the way we did the Soviets when they agreed to release some Christians from the basement of our embassy in Moscow. And Reagan said to Brezhnev, look, we are not going to crow if you release those people. We are going to thank you for it. Because he knew how difficult it was for the Soviet leadership to bring that about. And so the purpose here is to use, I was in this administration where we were handling the Soviet Union with pressure and diplomacy. And we were treating Iran with an erratic, absurd policy of threats. And then we finally did the Iran-Contra affair. I mean, it was totally amateurish. So on the one hand, we're dealing professionally, the way America is capable of dealing with an enemy. And on the other hand, dealing like a bunch of amateurs in a goofy movie when we were dealing with Iran.
Argo.
Oh, yeah. Argo's a little piece of it, yeah.
We have a set of questions from the audience about the real or potential connections between North Korea and Iran. What is the nature of their relationship in the past, the nuclear missile deals that might have been made, and what's the prospect for that in the future? To the best of my knowledge, we have pretty firm evidence of the North Korean assistance to Syria in building the reactor that was designed very similar to the Yongbyon reactor built in Syria to produce plutonium, a graphite reactor that potentially could have been used for a Syrian weapon or something else. We don't know the purpose, but its intent was quite clear. We know of missiles of North Korean assistance sold or bartered to Iran, to Pakistan, other countries. But we know of rumors, but I know nothing more than rumors of Iranian involvement, observers, with the North Korean testing program. Do any of you, can you add to any of those statements about the connection between North Korea and Iran? Målfrid.
Well, I'd like to make one observation. I mean, states like Iran and North Korea, they tend to help each other with programs like these, missile programs, and also with nuclear technology. And part of the reason is that, they may have intentions to develop military capabilities. But the other side of the coin is that they may actually be forced out of the legitimate nuclear marketplace. And that's certainly something that Iran has said time and time again. We tried to contact all of our former suppliers in the West. We even sued them, and we won. But still they wouldn't, fulfill their obligations under their former contracts. And so what other options did we have other than resort to the black nuclear market? And, we can discuss their intentions, but I think that's actually a valid point, that they were forced out of the legitimate nuclear marketplace, and that actually may have been a very bad decision. So I think it's a complicated issue.
Abbas, do you have any information or reports that you've been reading about North Korean Iranian connections?
Well, there are rumors and reports, they're not confirmed, that there have been some Iranians in the most recent experiment in North Korea. There are certainly North Koreans in Iran. There are certainly North Koreans in the city of Isfahan, where one of the research facilities is. But whether they have exchanged the kind of detailed data that would be helpful I have no firm information on that. But I would be surprised that they wouldn't, because they have been exchanging information. They have been exchanging technology on the missile question. They're working very closely on the missile question, on making the missiles. The Shahab 3 is virtually a remake of a North Korean missile.
We have a set of questions that point to the human cost, not of a war, but of the actions that the international community is taking to try to put pressure on Iran. What are the costs to the Iranian people of the current sanctions regime?
Well, I think it's been very substantial. Like all tyrannies, the leading people in Iran, the tyrants themselves, don't absorb the pain. The military programs, the nuclear program, the missile program will remain untouched, and the people of Iran will be damaged. Our sanctions policies in Iraq caused a lot of damage, and in Iran, you see now one of the leading civil liberties lawyers who's against the nuclear program, who has had to go to England and won the Nobel Prize for her work. Abbas, you know her. Yeah. She announced just a little while ago that she hopes the international community realizes that these sanctions are starting to really harm the ordinary people in Iran, especially with medical equipment. They've been forced, as you pointed out earlier, to buy contaminated medical equipment in various places. So I favor the sanctions pressures in principle, because I think pressure is needed. But so long as we're saying that we're not bluffing, and we know that the Koreans, the North Koreans, and the Iranians are talking to each other every day, what do you think the North Koreans are telling the Iranians? That's exactly what they said to us. I mean, President Clinton stood on the DMZ and said, under no circumstances will we allow North Korea to have a nuclear weapon. You know how firm we were verbally about preventing North Korea from having a nuclear weapon. So my concern is that by focusing just on this issue of prevention and blowing up the whole nuclear program, by the time we actually get there, we're going to finally realize, as we've been told very articulately here, that this is something that's not in our interest to do, that it's too complicated and too difficult. And meanwhile, we would not have done the relatively low-level pressure and serious diplomacy that we really need to do to engage Iran effectively.
Are there any last comments from the panel about what are, in brief bullet points, the steps that the United States could take in the next year to help resolve this crisis? Give me your top 2 or 3 actions briefly.
My view has been that the United States should, indicated this from many, many years ago, should do with Iran what the Reagan administration did with Soviet Union. Negotiate with them unconditionally, negotiate with them on all issues, negotiate with them as a despotic sovereign state. I'm sure when my colleague says negotiate with them as a sovereign state, it does not mean, because I've had this discussion with them, it does not mean to say that we negotiated with them in the spirit of accepting them as the rightful heirs of a culture as old as Iran. It is a regime that is in power. We must negotiate with it. Human rights, in my view, democracy, in my view, women's rights, in my view, the rights of minorities, religious minorities, are as important as the nuclear issue. Unless you have a democratic Iran, you will not have a resolution of the nuclear issue. The West has gotten it, I think, wrong. They played in the game, in the side of the field that the regime wanted. The regime's vulnerabilities are in democracy and human rights, not on the nuclear issue, and the regime outplayed the West, created a reality on the ground where they are now very close to, if we believe Baradei said 2 years ago that they're already beyond the point of no return.
Thank you, Abbas Milani. Abe Sofair, 1 minute.
Of course, I agree with that. And Ronald Reagan famously said the Soviet Union was the evil empire at the same time that he was implementing a serious diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union. You can believe that a state and a government, a form of government, is headed for the junk pile of human history, as he put it, and at the same time engage them, because it's in our interest to do that. And that's what we need to do with Iran. And I did it. I was privileged to negotiate with them for 5 years in The Hague. I was the negotiator for all the claims that the U.S. had against Iran. And we made a lot of progress in those 5 years. And after I left the government, very, very little has been done. And I would suggest that we restart those secret negotiations. They were all done in confidence until we actually achieved something, just as we did with the Soviets. We would negotiate with the Soviets in 10 different places. And when we announced deals, we had the heads of state or whatever get together and announce these progress that had been made. And it created a momentum. And it undermined, ultimately, the tyranny that was the Soviet Union.
Målfrid, do you have last few comments about what you think the United States could do?
So as a non-US citizen, let me give you 3 sort of Scandinavian recommendations. The first one is don't kill Iranian scientists, and take a clear position on that. Killing scientists and engineers will not stop a nuclear program or a nuclear weapons program in any country. It certainly didn't in the case of Iraq. We know that. The second point is don't try to combine engagement with regime change objectives. Be clear about what exactly you are doing and what your objectives are in the long term. And the third point is combine serious, and I do mean serious, diplomatic engagement with an effort to actually strengthen the IAEA's role and their insight, both in terms of their access in Iran, but also in terms of their budget and their actual capacity to monitor the Iranian program in a serious way.
Well, thank you, Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer. And let me just conclude by noting that it seems to me that any potential solution has to be a compromise by 2 sovereign states. The United States and its allies would have to, in my judgment, accept that Iran has a conditional right to enrich uranium and have civilian nuclear power. But I underscore the term conditional, because Iran has to accept that that right is conditional upon the International Atomic Energy Agency confirming that they have no nuclear weapons program activities going on, and they'd have to accept genuine constraints beyond what they have been willing to do thus far. So there are both very serious and genuine reasons to be concerned about what will happen over the next year, but there also are serious and genuine reasons to see some rays of hope. And with that last mixed message, please join me in thanking our Stanford guests.